Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing a painting of some beautiful spring blossom, early spring blossom, based on this photograph from Pixabay, which I shall put the link to in the description below. I'm going to simplify it to start with, and I'm going to use masking fluid, and this is my brand of masking fluid, but any masking fluid will do, to mask out the blossom and just the blossom. You can see that I've roughly drawn in a few very simple branch shapes that are similar to the ones in the photograph, and I've put in my little blossoms and blossom buds, covered those with the masking fluid, and now I'm going to start to do a nice soft washy wet in wet underpainting to create the background for my twigs, stems and blossoms. I'm going to simplify the background to just being pink and like a bit of the white of the paper, and I'm going to use a little bit of brown but very pale along with the pink to get this lovely sort of wet in wet background. So I've started off with my board flat so that the paint will stay where I put it, and my paper this time is Saunders Waterford High White hot press paper, so it's a lovely smooth surface, a nice white paper rather than my usual natural white, which is creamier. I think high white works a lot better for flowers. And so my board is flat. It's taped with, the paper is taped with ordinary decorator's masking tape, and I used a water spray to wet my paper randomly, so some parts are wet, some parts are dry, and this is mostly Opera Rose with a little bit of, just check what it's called, quinacridone purple, I think, or quin purple as I'll call it for short, and also a little bit of very watery sepia, which you can see I'm dropping in near to the in the bottom half of the painting, just to get a few very subtle brown tones in amongst the pinks. I've also spattered a bit into it, just lightly, and you can see now everything's running around, and I'm just using my small calligraphy brush to drag the paint around any bits that I've missed or where it's pooling up around the edges of the masking fluid. You can see I'm beginning to get a really interesting wash, and it's at this stage you can put as much or as little paint in as you like, any colours that you like, to build up just the sort of strength of background that you want. Adding the water spray to any spattering will soften it out, but of course it'll add a lot more water to your painting. So if you do need sometimes to tip and tilt your board just to pour off any excess water that's building up across the middle of the painting. I think my background is almost where I want it. I think now, as the background is beginning to dry, I'm using a richer mixture of Opera Rose and Quin Purple, a darker mixture you can see here, and just spattering it across around where my main flowers are, and it's actually staying like little blooms, little bursts of colour around the masking fluid. And now towards the top I'm going to add a bit more light with my salt. The salt should push away the pale pink paint, but very subtly, and just give me these little white blooms near the top. So I get a bit more light at the top where the light's coming in through the trees, and darker at the bottom where I've got the sepia. And as I'm sure you've realised, this sort of wet in wet process is very experimental, but it's very unique. Every time you do this, you'll get slightly different effects. And that's part of the joy of this, is that it's very unpredictable. But I'm going to now leave it to dry completely and then come back and see how it looks, and then begin to work on the branches and blossoms. So here it is. It's totally dry and I think it's dried really nicely. You can see how the masking fluid has preserved the white of the paper for the blossoms. That means I'll get some lovely crisp impressionistic blossoms when I come to paint them in. But I'm not going to remove the masking fluid yet. I'm going to paint in my branches, and this will help me to get the effect of some of the blossoms sort of looking like they're behind the branches or in front of the branches. So I'm painting through any blossoms that have masking fluid on them, because obviously that will resist the paint, and when I come to remove the masking fluid I will be able to paint some blossoms partially over the branches. I used my small calligraphy brush there, but any small brush with a point or small round brush will do for this, depending on the size of your branches. And this is a mixture of sepia with a little bit of raw sienna mixed into it to warm it up a bit. And I've dabbed back the paint here and there with a tissue to add a bit of texture and tone. And then I can go back in and darken up the right side of the branch with some sepia mixed with a bit of Payne's grey to get it nice and dark, and this will diffuse into the sepia branch paint a little bit, but it should keep me a nice hard edge on the left but diffuse softly into the branch itself. This helps to give me some dimension, sort of 3D-ness to my branch. And then next, while the branch paint is still wet, I'm using the same small calligraphy brush to drag out some nice dark little stubby branches and spikes that I can see in the original photograph, upon which the little blossom buds and blossoms themselves are forming. The contrast of these little stubby spiky branches painted dark against the more brown textured sort of bark-like look of the main branch gives me quite a realistic effect here, but just using very simple brushwork to try and depict or suggest what I'm trying to show. Now I'm continuing to paint the other branches in the same way, and that's using sepia with a little bit of raw sienna to start with, knocking that back with the tissue, then darkening up with that bit of Payne's grey added to the mixture on the left side of the branch, and putting in those sort of stubby twigs. Now here I'm using a thicker brush. It's my Polina Bright #1 round, and I'm establishing the main branch. And I'm doing it in exactly the same way, but I'm going to add a bit more detail eventually to this branch just to draw more attention to it. So I'm making sure I really darken up parts of it. So I'm using quite strong paint. So the size of this branch means we're bringing it forward slightly and making sure that everything's nicely emphasised. And I'm going to try and draw more attention to the blossom when I come to paint it in. Now I'm trying for quite a stylised painting style here. I'm not looking for realism. I want to keep it fairly loose and simple, but also just to make it sort of look quite impressionistic, really, I suppose, and very soft and sort of spring-like with these beautiful, rich blossoms. And I think now you can see that I've got different thicknesses and slightly different angles for my branches, that the composition itself is building up, but without becoming over-cluttered so far. There are a lot more branches, obviously, in the photograph, but I'm trying to keep this, as I say, fairly stylised and fairly simple. And now that I'm happy with that and that my branches have completely dried off, I can remove the masking fluid. So I can either remove it by rubbing it off with a clean finger, or I can use an eraser and use that to remove the masking fluid, or you can use the tacky side of a piece of masking tape. But just make sure that all of the traces of the masking fluid latex are completely removed from the painting, and then brush off all the little crumbs from the painting before you continue. So now it's time to paint in the little blossom buds and the blossom. So I'm going to start at the top, and using my small calligraphy brush and a mixture of opera rose and quin purple and varying amounts of water according to whether I want a pale mark or a dark mark. And to start with, just putting in these little simple dot shapes over my masked areas where there are just little traces of buds that have yet to open. And then using the brush to describe these larger flowers, several often next to each other. So do some darker than others and some lighter, so that you differentiate between sort of a few little sprays of blossom here. Now, you may have noticed that my board is no longer flat as it was to get the original wash. It's at an angle of 45 degrees. And if you watch closely, you can see the paint from my washes on my flowers is running down towards the bottom of each flower. And that's naturally giving me that darker shadow across the bottom of each flower or bud. And as you can see, by building up the larger blooms across the middle and bottom and right side of my painting, there's a bit more space left, top left and top right. But that just gives this central area a bit more focus. And of course, if you decide to paint something similar, please feel free to put more detail into your flowers. I want to keep them very loose and very impressionistic and soft. And now I'm adding some spatter here and there. Now this time I'm not adding too much, just enough across those central focal point flowers, and that just gives them a little tiny bit more emphasis. Not much, but just a little bit more focus, keeping the edges of the background more unfocused, if you see what I mean. So I'm nearly finished. I think I've just got to focus on putting in a few more shadows. So I've got Payne's grey and a little bit of sepia, a nice rich dark colour, and I'm going to paint over some of these spiky stubby branches so I can join them into the main branch, so it looks like they're coming out from the front of the branch, if you see what I mean. By darkening them up, I'm bringing them forward a little bit, and then putting in some shadow, particularly near the base of the painting, working around the blossom carefully and sort of bringing some shadows down over the branches, increasing a little bit of darkness here and there on the edge of the branches. And now for some final details for the branches, mostly the main branch, bringing across some just little lines and dots here and there to increase the look of texture and tone on the bark. And this is sort of making the branch look more rounded as well, if you see what I mean. So it's helping to cement that illusion of these stylized spring blossoms. So I think I'm just about happy with that as my first try at painting this sort of a painting. I may go into more detail if I was to try something similar again. But I'm going to remove the tape and have a look and see how it looks with its clean white border. That gives us a look at it with fresh eyes and helps us to see whether or not it's finished. Sometimes we need to add a little bit more detail, but at other times we realise that we've done enough. I like how the very soft pale pink wash you can see it a lot more clearly. Now we've got the white border, you can really see how delicate it is, but how useful it is at showing off and giving depth and distance to our foreground blossoms. And I'm also hoping that you've noticed how much we've simplified from the photograph. We've just taken a few main branches and emphasised the blossom and pushed the background back a bit. And if we zoom in a bit, you can see that there's only a little bit of spatter, but that it really enhances the detail and the illusion of complexity, as does the little faint bit of salt at the top and the faint tinges of sepia across the bottom in the background. Well, I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you click on the bell icon, that means that you'll get a notification every time I post, which is 2 or 3 times a week. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.